Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the 5th installment of our webinar series, Leading Through Crisis, hosted by the Guelph Chamber of Commerce and the Lang School. My name is Shakiba Shayani, CEO at the Guelph Chamber, a not-for-profit member-driven organization where we advocate, connect, and convene on behalf of members to foster economic prosperity for our community. I'm very pleased you could all join us today. Before we get started, I ask that you take a second and complete the poll that is currently up on your screens. This will help our panelists understand who exactly is in the audience today. We will also be posting polls throughout the webinar that will inform our speakers' content, so please take a moment to answer each one. Our webinar today will explore challenges employers face as businesses prepare for increased workforce activity as COVID-19 restrictions are eased. Our expert panel will discuss structural changes to HR demand and supply, highlighting complex and underexplored changes that may present challenges to worker reemployment. A few housekeeping items before we jump into the discussion. Please feel free to submit questions throughout the webinar. We will try to take questions after each segment, as well as at the end of the webinar. We have enabled upvoting on questions, so if you see a question you would like answered, simply upvote it and we'll try to address the most popular ones. So we can see our original poll results here. Nice to see that we have a lot of participation, of course, from our educational institution, small businesses, medium-sized businesses, as well as also from entrepreneurs and not-for-profit organizations. So welcome and thank you for joining. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our three experts. Dr. Nita Chhinzer is an associate professor in human resource management at the University of Guelph's Lang School of Business and Economics. As an award-winning researcher in HR management issues, her research, teaching, and consulting is focused on strategic HR, job loss, layoffs, employability, and employment law. In 2016, she was recognized by Canadian HR Reporter magazine as one of the top 25 HR professionals in Canada. She also authors Canada's best-selling post-secondary human resource management textbook. I'd also like to welcome Sandra Casarin. She is an HR manager for the manufacturing sector here in Guelph. She has been a member of the Guelph and District Human Resources Professionals Association for 15 years and has served on the board for 8. She maintains a diploma in human resource management and has received training in a variety of areas, including coaching, leadership development, project management, and workplace accident investigations. I also welcome Greg Pinks. Greg is the Chief Leadership Officer of Axiom Performance, Inc. For more than 20 years, he has been the VP HR and worked alongside leaders within organizations, providing them with the tools and support to thrive. Now, as Chief Leadership Officer of Axiom Performance, Greg provides executive coaching to leaders, to full executive teams, and helps develop up-and-coming leaders as they learn the true impact of their new responsibilities. Greg is a certified human resources executive, has earned a Master's of Industrial Relations from Queen's University, and holds a master's level designation as Certified Executive Coach. I'm also pleased, of course, to note that Axiom Performance is a Guelph Chamber member. Now, Nita, let's begin with you.
Sounds good. Thanks for the introduction. So today we've put together a team. I'll be the academic expert, Greg and Sandra are the industry experts. And as the academic expert, I really want to challenge you to think about the strategic options that are available. And it's weird to see this silver lining or the golden lining on this cloud here, but there is an opportunity here for us to do some really exciting things, because I think that there's been no time that HR has been on the forefront as it is now. What I want to talk about is how we're currently in a phase where things are opening up, but they're opening up slowly. And through effective HR planning, we'll be able to be more responsive to what's going on, as well as come up with ways that can help the business recover. Let's talk about what generally HR planning is. So HR planning tries to take a look at supply of human resources. So where do we have the types of human resources? How can we access them? And demand for human resources. How many do we need and in what capacity? Let's break it down here. So when it comes to supply and demand, we have to think about what's going on outside of the organization. We have high levels of volatility. We're not quite sure what our clients are doing, what our customers are doing, and we're not really in control of when the government opens up the regulations around us. So before I get into demand, I wanted to ask out a poll question. So let's launch the poll question now. That question asks, how has your customer demand changed since the COVID-19 restrictions? And we'll give you a couple of seconds to look at this. Essentially, since the restrictions came into place, our demand changed and that was outside of our control. And when these restrictions get lifted, the demand will also change and that will also be outside of our control. But strategically, there's a couple of things that I want to recommend that you do from an HR planning perspective. One is to think about who can actually be effective here in helping us rebuild the organization. And our previous forecasting techniques won't work anymore, because we're not going back to the pre-COVID days. We're going into this new normal, and we can't use our previous trends to predict what's going to happen in the future. Instead, I recommend that we use the Delphi technique or the nominal group technique, which is a technique where we bring in some of the experts, some of the people who might know the company well, might know the clients well, perhaps the managers. Now's the right time to bring them back and ask them, hey, what do you think demand for our products or services will be like in the future when we open up? When we're allowed to do curbside, when we're allowed to have a few people in. What I noticed here is that your demand has decreased significantly. For some of you, it's actually increased. So for those of you who it's decreased significantly, bring in those experts, and also for those of you who it has increased, bring in that nominal group technique to say, not only where do we see demand increase, but how do we see demand increase? Are we going to be looking at more requirements now for people to be doing curbside delivery or pickup or security? Where will we see demand increasing? Because we'll need to recruit in those areas. Recruiting right now itself is going to be a challenge I'll talk about. And the other thing I want to talk about when you're coming up with your HR plan for demand, maybe it's best instead of trying to peg one specific mark, is you come up with a range. So you think about your best case, worst case, and your most likely scenario. And then you have contingency plans, what you would do to ramp up for your best case scenario, what you do to ramp down for your worst case scenario, and how you can kind of meet the middle there. Another thing that I would recommend is that you prepare for some short-term surges. So some of you have businesses that have taken off, 18% of you did. But when we think about reopening up to the economy, I know barber shops and retailers had a surge in demand once they opened up. And to prepare for the short-term surge, there's a couple of options I can recommend or solutions that can help you. One, you might actually consider extending your hours. So if you're limited by the capacity of your physical space and the number of people you can have in, to anticipate a surge in demand, you might consider extending your hours, at least in the short term, while you deal with that surge. A second is that you might actually find that in the short term, you need to add employees. So I know a colleague of mine runs a housekeeping company, and she'll need to add employees as she deals with the surge in demand that's coming forward. Another is you might need to redesign jobs. So for example, a barber shop might need to redesign the job. So the barber does the predominant role of cutting hair, and they parse out some of the responsibilities of answering the phones, dealing with people who are coming in, payment, to someone who doesn't have the skills that the barber has. So parsing out the work and redesigning the job might result in an increase, at least to deal with that temporary surge in demand. So I do highly recommend that we get prepared for that temporary surge in demand that's coming forward. We see that most of you did have a decrease in demand, and even those of you who had an increase had to come up with ways to reduce your workforce, hopefully, well, unfortunately in the past. Let's put up the second poll now. The second poll asks, what workforce reduction techniques have you used thus far? Please select all that applied. And I want to take you back. I know it feels like a lifetime ago for some of you and a minute ago for others, but it was 9 weeks ago that we heard that we have to close down businesses, try to work from home as much as possible, and we were really limited in what we could do. When we had that, we essentially had an environment where some of us had to create an environment where we broke the employment relationship with the employee through various measures, which are in this survey. Now that we're looking at coming back, we have to think about how we're going to re-employ people. And for that, there's two strategic challenges I want to bring to your attention. The first strategic challenge is you need to think about what employees you're going to bring back and in what capacity. In this case, there's been some back and forth with some employers that I know, and they're thinking about bringing back people in a part-time capacity. My recommendation is to bring people back in a full-time capacity. It serves two purposes. The first purpose is that we can actually bring back people with a limited level of exposure. So we're limiting the exposure from the infectious disease to only a limited number of employees, or bring them back in a full-time capacity. Two is we're actually able to mitigate some of the competition we're getting through the reservation wages that are increased because of the CERB. So let me bring that back to non-academic speak. What that means is that we've had to traditionally compete against almost the CERB when we're bringing employees back. If we have an employee who's going to make $2,000 a month staying at home, and we bring them back for a job that might only be paying them $1,200 or $1,600, they're going to choose to not come back, and that's going to create a little bit of a problem for us. So I do recommend we bring back workers in a full-time capacity. The other thing that we have to think about when we bring back our workers is focusing on the right quantity and quality of workers that we want. This is a great time for us to reevaluate our approach to talent management. Originally, when the layoffs happened, and I see most of you did engage in temporary layoffs, about 50% of you, 42% reduced hours, and 36% had their employees use vacation time. So these are very common practices, and I hope that you're learning a lot from these polls, because I certainly am. But what we saw is most of you had to engage in temporary layoffs or reduction in work hours. And as you ease, you're going to have to make strategic decisions about which employees you will bring back. I recommend you take a look at which employees you think are going to help you succeed in the organization the most. And rather than reducing hours, bring them back in a full-time capacity. I also suggest you take a look at which jobs are going to help you the most in these hours. So then that way you can take a look at which employees and which jobs specifically are core to your organization. We also will need to go on to thinking about which employees will exit relatively soon. So for those of you, the 50% of you who engaged in temporary layoffs in Ontario qualify for only a 13-week period. We're about 9 weeks into the full closure. Some of you had to do that a little bit earlier, but after 13 weeks, it turns into a permanent layoff. So if you're thinking about recall and bringing employees back, now's the time for you to reach out to specific employees and incentivize them to come back to work. How can you incentivize against some of those CERB assistant benefits that are going out there? Well, there's a couple of things. One is if you've got a really strong employee, you want to highlight for them that bringing them back to work is going to help them in the long term with employment. Because we know once the CERB benefits come to an end, there's going to be a flood of unemployment. The second thing you can consider is to remind them that you do have that recall right. And if an employee is offered a job to come back and they choose not to come back, then they're actually not temporarily laid off anymore. Legally, they've actually abandoned their job, and it's the equivalent of a dismiss. It's the equivalent of them quitting. So you want to remind them that you're not at liberty to hold, or you're not required to hold the job for them until they're at a point to come back. You're at liberty to hold the job for them until you need them back and you offer them the position. So that offer does not mean that you're holding that job for them for a long time. The third thing I recommend is you even think about the idea of potentially doing a small wage increase over the short term as we deal with the surge. There's an incentive for you to do the short-term wage increase if you qualified for the CEWS, so the wage subsidy that came out through the government. Now's a good time to hold a little bit more supply too in terms of trying to strategically position the organization. So you might want to bring on more employees than what you regularly hold and think about how you can help them and how they can help you re-engage the organization, pivot the organization, and help with organizational strategy. That was a lot for me to cover off in 8 minutes, but I'm going to move on to my colleagues, Sandra and Greg, who will talk about some of the operational issues. And so if there's any questions, Shakiba, then
Yes.
let me know.
Thank you, Nita. That was a great overview. I do want to make a note to all of our attendees today who might be feverishly trying to take notes as you speak, that we will be sharing some content and resources from all three of our panelists that you are referencing in an email afterwards.
And I noticed a number of my alumni on the call, so they know me well enough to know they like to just dump out the info, but I'll give you my notes, no problem.
Perfect. Now, before I pass it over to Sandra, I do have a question from someone who wants to know if you could speak to the idea that, in fact, instead of 13 weeks, 35-week temporary layoff is available if benefits are included.
Yeah, so the 35-week layoff is available if benefits are included. So legally, you can continue to pay benefits for your employees, and then that way they're still on a temp layoff. The challenge then is if at the end of the 35-week, now I'm going to put on my employment law hat, okay? But if at the end of the 35 weeks, you let the employee go via a permanent layoff because your business hasn't picked up, you're technically liable for that full 35-week period. So a lot of the legal professionals that I know, a lot of people who are in employment law, feel that this is a good time to start to mitigate your risks, especially if you think that that person might not be the right person to help the business recover. if there is someone who you think that you really want to bring on and you think that they're going to be a great fit and you're willing to take that risk, that you might be on the hook for a wrongful dismissal for the 35 weeks worth of pay, then by all means you can take that. But I think that the legal hat in me says that it's probably best to not try to predict with a second wave coming or what's going to happen 35 weeks down the road. I mean, this has been 9 weeks for us, and I didn't anticipate it would be like this. So I personally wouldn't take a lot of risks for 35 weeks down the road. I hope that helps.
That's good feedback. Thank you. Okay, now to Sandra.
My name's Sandra, and I work for an essential manufacturing company with 2 locations, one in Guelph and one in Milton. For me, I know when the pandemic came out, it was chaos. Not sure where to begin and where to end. In the beginning, I'm sure every HR colleague experienced this. Everyone came to us for the answers, not realizing that this was all new to us also. So employees were scared. We had many requests for vacation time. We were more than happy to accommodate until we hit a low head count, and then we needed to make sure people were here. So it became very clear to us then we needed a focus to put something in place to make sure these things were happening and employees felt safe. So if we can get the first poll question up now. So the best practice for employers, you're wondering who does this land on for making this happen? That mostly falls under the HR, at least at my location it did. I did, however, delegate to the departments that could make it happen, like our purchasing department and things like that. Ensure you have hand sanitizers at each entranceway, mainly the employees and the main entrance. This can be purchased from your regular supplier. We used Weber's and they seemed to be well equipped at the time when we purchased. I would check with your purchasing department and see what they can arrange for you. It's better to have more on hand than less. Add floor markings and barriers to manage traffic flow and physical distancing. Where I work, we were pretty fortunate as our machines are over 6 feet apart. So if you're not able to do this, it might be best to shift the schedule so you can have employees work perhaps 2 machines apart, or like Toyota, a good example, put plexiglass barriers in where that you have the availability to divide them this way. The use of infrared thermometers. We currently try to test, I see, so we do have in the results there a lot of essential businesses, so that's really good to see. You all know and are familiar what it's like in these difficult times. So for the use, back to the infrared thermometers, we currently have them on site if we need them. We do try to test any visitors or guests that might be coming in. If you choose to test your employees, the best thing to do is assign an individual who can be at the employee entrance for each shift prior to the employee start time. Then they would be tested before entering the building and then sanitizing their hands before they officially go in. So provide your employees with masks. Although they do not protect yourself, although they do not protect yourself, they protect others should you be sick. Face masks are very hard to find at this point, so I did some research and found a lady in Guelph that makes cloth masks. We order from her and it seemed to help with the employees feeling safer. I can supply her name to you if you like at the end of the event. Stagger your start times, shifts, breaks, and lunch times. Limit your lunch rooms to 5 or less, washrooms to 2 or less. Minimize the number of people using each piece of equipment in instances where sharing equipment cannot be avoided. You would need to have a policy on sanitizing your equipment. Make sure you provide each machine with a disinfectant solution that employees can wipe their machines before they use them and after they are completed. This also gives a sense of safety to the employees. So the best practices for employees. Make sure you wash your hands often with soap and water for at least 20 seconds or alcohol-based hand sanitizer. So if we can get the second poll up, that would be great. Sneeze and cough into your sleeve. Avoid touching your eyes, nose, or mouth, and avoid contact with people who are sick. If you are ill, do not enter the building. Return home once you are safely and contact your supervisor. There will be some websites at the end that can be very helpful to get you set up on these. I also have a few posters that we'll be sending to everyone that I used to need to post them up. I placed a lot of these in the washrooms and anywhere there's a sink where employees can wash their hands. We have a lot of websites that help out that we'll be glad to share at the end. Public Health Ontario, Health and Safety System Partners, and additional guidance from ontario.ca coronavirus. Creating policies and enforcing them is very important to do. All employers need to post and communicate COVID-19 policies to workers. I also have a policy on that I'm willing to share if people would like to use it. These policies should cover how the workplace will operate during and after COVID-19, including, but not limited to, the sanitization of the workplace, deep cleaning of machines, wiping down of machinery, how workers will report their illness, how to ensure physical distancing by not holding meetings in closed quarters, how work will be scheduled, work from home policy. Oh, so it looks good. A lot of people, to what extent you have a COVID-19 outbreak plan in your workplace? A lot, 26% have a complete plan now. That's amazing, because I know they were not fun to put into place. Research on the sites that we provide at the end will help with creating these policies. So, and I'm happy to share with anyone who might not have policies. I'm willing to share mine and help you with that. You can reach out to me at any time, and I'll be more than happy. So make sure when you're creating your policies, you have a place for employees to sign off and you are keeping record. It is very important because if the MOL does come in for a visit, they are going to ask you how you trained them, where the proof is that they actually read the policies. So make sure you have a way of having them sign off for each one. It works the same for training the employees. How did you train them on the following procedures? Make sure during the training you're keeping the records on what they have been trained on and do they understand the concept. This also may come up if you have an Ministry of Labor visit. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. That's helpful. And for anyone who didn't catch, MOL is Ministry of Labor, correct?
Yes, it is the Ministry of Labor. My apologies.
No problem. So a quick question from an attendee who says, WSIB for work from home employees. Can you speak to WSIB at all?
I'm not really familiar with how the WSIB works for working from home employees. Nita, would you happen to have, or Greg, any answer for that one?
I think that even when workers work from home, we still have to cover off the WSIB payments. I know that that occurs, but when it comes to occupational health and safety and the limits of where we're having exposure, it's limited to where their workspace is. So for example, if someone got hurt while they were taking out the garbage and it was during their working day, that technically wouldn't be their workspace. The workspace would be the desk that they were at. And I know that if we mandate employees to work from home, that it's our responsibility to provide them with all of the requirements that they need to work from home, so the laptop, the table, etc. But if they choose to work from home, then that's not an expense that we need to cover off, but I still recommend that we offer training to employees who are working from home to ensure that some of those ergonomic issues don't come into play. The thing I did find the most interesting was the fact that we have to limit it to their workplace. So if the workplace is their physical desk and they get hurt while they're getting themselves something to eat or taking out the garbage, that's outside of the scope of WSIB. I hope that helps.
That's helpful. Thank you, Nita, and thank you, Sandra, for your presentation. Now on to Greg.
Thanks, Shakiba. I want to take us to some of the really positive things that I'm seeing within companies right now with respect to people leadership. But for a moment, let's go back to the root of all of this, because I use people leadership. So let's talk about people for a moment and talk about the human perspective in all this. This is a highly emotional time for people. When you look at all what's going on, people are concerned about their own health. They're concerned about the health and wellness of their loved ones. They're concerned about their finances. And we've got this uncertain future in front of us. So any one of those elements is a significant stress. And then we've got all four of these converging all at the same time, plus other things going on, things called homeschooling and other factors like that. So one of the key traits that I'm seeing from powerful leaders right now is the trait of empathy. And they're getting close, they're being close with their people and knowing where their people are at. Because all folks are in different places right now, and it's very powerful to recognize that. And particularly as we're looking at further expansion into the workplaces right now, as we open things up, we've got some folks that are scared to come to work at one end of the spectrum, other folks that are eager to get back to work. So from a people leadership perspective, if we broaden the perspective again, we've got a couple key questions. How do we meet people where they are at? And how do we reduce anxieties? And I'm seeing some common themes amongst the best organizations out there right now. And I'll note three. One is a crystal clear focus on safety. And Sandra has already gone over a number of those elements. Second is what I call ABC time. Always be communicating. Even if you're closed down, there's a few that are completely closed down. Hopefully you're communicating with your staff and your workforce at least on a weekly basis. And the third area is planning in a flexible and collaborative way. And that's where I want to focus this conversation a bit, because this is a great opportunity for flexibility and collaboration right now. As we heard in one of the previous webinars in this series, leaders aren't expected to have all the answers at this point in time. How could we be expected to have all the answers? Because none of us have been through this before. And we also don't know the unique circumstances that all our staff are facing. So it's a wonderful time. And I'm seeing organizations really pick up on this opportunity to be collaborative and flexible. And as we get into our contingency planning, as Nita talked about, there's all sorts of contingency plans to put in place right now, from full reentry, partial reentry, all the new orientations that go around reentry with all of Sandra's new health and safety policies and programs, as well as, at the very least, planning our responses for when a staff member contracts COVID-19. And I saw in the previous poll, lots of organizations have started their contingency planning. But hopefully here we've got a very specific contingency plan around an isolation room for individuals who might have rapid onset of symptoms. We've drafted our written communications to employees, drafted our written communications to customers. Also, we can approach these things in a much more calm and deliberate fashion when they happen. So let's look at, talking about that, let's look at our next poll. Have you had any direct employee contract COVID-19? So as we're seeing in this reentry planning, there is what I'm seeing within organizations is a trend to what I call a la carte menus to meet the needs of people coming from very different places. So what do I mean by a la carte menus? Is this opportunity, and it was within one of the previous polls, of different ways for people to reintegrate into the workplace. So whether it's shifting their schedules, whether it's working some weekends, whether it's temporarily shifting to part-time, whether it's using vacation pay to supplement reductions in wages. For some organizations where staff are relying on public transit, I know of organizations that are hiring company shuttle buses to help people get to and from work. The more options that we can provide, the more that we can meet people where they are at, and more that we can build trust within the organization. So let's take a quick look at the survey results, if we could. And sorry, my screen is, let me, so, okay, 82% no, which is good. 6% I don't know, which I'd be curious to learn more about, but thankfully in Guelph, it's low at this point in time. All right, moving on. I want to talk about some great activity around how organizations are ensuring people are feeling connected through this pandemic and hopefully into the post-pandemic phase. But for the foreseeable future, nothing is going to be normal. We're going to have people that are continuing to work from home. They're going to be working different shifts. And even if they're on site, they're either going to be in PPE or physically distant from each other. And in the long term, we are going to see a shift. And I believe part of this is going to be due to economics. But we saw a shift recently with announcements from OpenText that they are closing down half of their global offices. The economics behind this is they figure they're going to save between $65 and $75 million a year. Now, that's not all from just closing down those offices, but a significant portion is. They figure that 95% of their organization can successfully work from home. So we're going to see long-term shifts here. In the short term, we're seeing organizations finding really creative ways of keeping people connected. So whether it's through WhatsApp celebrations, whether it's through social hours on Zoom, some organizations I'm working with are sending care packages to employees' homes to help them feel valued and connected to the organization. Perhaps within operations, instead of having one big shift huddle at the beginning of the day, we're having multiple small shift huddles. The point here is that these things have to be premeditated and purposeful. Right? We're no longer bumping into each other randomly, no longer having those random social connections. So we have to be planned and purposeful in how we build social connections into the organization. Lastly, we also want to connect people to the broader purpose of the organization, because as we know, people are anxious in returning to work. People are anxious at being at work. If we're in a healthcare situation or setting, people know the connection to what they're doing to the broader good that we're doing within the community. But I'm seeing organizations outside of healthcare doing a good job of creating rallying cries during this pandemic. So how are we contributing to the greater good? So if the organization's in food services, it might be creating a rallying cry about keeping Canadians fed. If an organization is supporting telecommunications, the rally cry might be around keeping Canadians connected. So let's move on to our next poll question. Has your organization found ways to rally and celebrate employees during this pandemic? And as you're completing that, I'll leave you with my final thought here, that in the long term, workplace cultures are going to change. We are going to see a higher proportion of folks that are working from home. And therefore, the workplace is no longer going to be the gathering place for everybody. It's going to be much more dispersed, which creates challenges when creating a unique culture. So we've got time here, and I encourage you over the next year or so to try a whole lot of different things to keep people feeling connected, keep people feeling connected to what your unique culture is about. Try different things and see what works for you. So if we can just look at the results from this last poll. Yeah, 32% have figured it out, which is fantastic. Perhaps you can share some ideas with us. 42 have tried things and can keep finding things to do better. And for the 26% that haven't tried anything yet, certainly encourage you to do so. Again, even if you're closed down, you can still have Zoom social hours at certain times to keep people connected. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Greg. That was great. Okay, so we're going to move on to some general Q&A questions that have been posed, and I do highly recommend that anyone that's listening that has HR-related questions to not hesitate to ask. We may not know all the answers, but this is an excellent opportunity to hear directly from experts. So the first question I have is, can training be done virtually? Is that an acceptable method? And I'll put it out to all three of you.
I can start with that in that because I'm doing virtual training at this point in time. So there has definitely been a shift, and it depends to some degree what type of virtual training we're talking about, but I can briefly talk about virtual training from a leadership perspective. What we're finding the trend here is to do it in much shorter increments, perhaps an hour to an hour and a half. So focus in on one or a few elements and keep it fairly active, that it's on people's minds on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. So shorter time frames and perhaps quicker segments over the weeks.
Great. Sandra, can you speak to any training that might be available related to HR specifically?
I do what we use at our company, and I'm not sure about other people, but we use HR downloads. And they do a lot of training on there where your certificates are printed out of proof of training. They have all sorts of different training available too. So if you're not set up with HR downloads, I would suggest taking a look at them. And like I say, certificates are printed at the end, so you have your proof of training there. I'm sure there are many other available, but I'm just aware of HR downloads currently.
Great, thank you. Nita, I don't know if you have anything to add, or I can jump to the next question. All good? Okay, so we have a question where someone's wondering if any of you know who is responsible for tracking that 14-day isolation period from the employer's position. Who or and how should we be tracking the 14-day isolation period?
So Sandra, do you want to take a look at this kind of from an RTW perspective, a return to work?
Yeah, sure. So what we do is, and I'm sure other HR colleagues, when we have an employee that's gone off on the 14-day isolation, we have a tracking calendar. So make sure you also have that put into place at work. So a tracking calendar, and then I have the employee after the 13-day reach out, see what their symptoms are. If they had COVID, then they need to have a certificate from their doctor saying that they are no longer infected with COVID and they're able to return to work. If they were just in 14-day isolation, then what we look at is we chat with them. How are they feeling? Do they have a temperature, cough, shortness of breath? And then we make the decision as the employer, are they okay to come back to work?
That's excellent, thank you. Nita, did you want to say something?
No, I think she covered it off really well. And so we can't ask for a doctor's note when they leave, but if they were tested positive, we can ask when they return. And it's our responsibility to ask when they return to ensure a safe workplace for our remaining employees.
That's a great clarification, thank you. Actually, the next question I might direct directly to you, Nita. What percentage of jobs and what kind can be done from home? Are there higher paid jobs more likely to be done from home?
Okay, so this question I really like, and I asked the same question, but surprisingly, I know Mahmood asked this question online, but we're not the only ones asking. So there was a general social survey that was done to see what kind of jobs can be done from home. And that was done by StatsCan in 2016. So they found that certain jobs can't be done from home. We're talking about accommodation and food service industry jobs, trades, transportation, warehousing, retail trade. Those industries generally don't have jobs that can be done from home. Alternatively, there's certain occupations. So manufacturing, such as the jobs that Sandra's been exposed to, those can't be done from home. Transportation, sales and service, health-related occupations. There's certain occupations that can't be done from home. So there's almost 45% of the work that they're doing or more that can't be done remotely. You may have employees who are in a hybrid situation where they may need to come into the work 3 days of the week and then do the remainder of their week at home. And that's also an option. But research has shown us that traditionally certain jobs and occupations cannot be done from home. So remote working just simply isn't a solution there. The second part of that question also was, is there a bit of an inequity built in? And I understand what you're trying to get into there when you're saying about, are there more educated people? And the truth is that education is a differentiating factor over who can work from home and who can't. So traditionally, people who have a higher education are put in more professional jobs where the tools that they need to do the work are here and here. The tools are not in any other capacity. So there is a bias where we do have people who are more educated, more able to work from home. Actually, the people who can't work from home are generally those people who are considered vulnerable workers. the ones that are less secure with lower quality jobs, they also experience more job loss. And surprisingly, it's women. So women are also the ones who are coming into the jobs that often can't be done from home. Women in this case also are in a catch-22. If they're working from home, they still bear the brunt of the responsibilities for childcare, and without childcare solutions solved here, that's something for us when it comes to bring our employees back. And they're also the ones who can't do the jobs that work from home and have to be into the workplace a little bit more often. I hope that answers your question, Mahmood, but if you want, I will also include the link to the survey that was done by StatsCan in my notes.
That would be perfect. Thank you, Nita. And a good reminder about having compassion for those transitioning from home to work or at home again. So thank you.
Shakiba, I can add a little bit to that if you want.
Please.
Just a couple other statistics, because Nita covered it off well there, but a couple other things that we've seen out of the Bureau of Labor Stats out of the States. They're saying approximately 7% of the workforce today is working from home across the US. I would imagine it's similar in Canada, working from home either part-time or full-time. OECD has looked at things from a global perspective and found that they figure about 40% of jobs can be done from home in some way, shape, or form. So that's on a very global scale. So as Nita said, it's very industry specific. Open Text, for example, 95% of their employees can work from home. We've got lots of industries where it's pretty well zero. The average seems to be around 40%.
Well, that's good to know. It's to have that global context is helpful. Another question is, do any of you have suggestions for engaging employees working from home who were not active as part of the team prior to COVID? And maybe Greg, I'll start with you about engaging employees working from home who were not active as part of the team prior to COVID.
So I'm assuming from that question, they're new employees by being not active.
Or
so that's
for a period of time.
Sorry?
Or perhaps off for a period of time.
Yeah, true. Yeah, it's a great question, and I know a lot of people are asking this question, particularly from an onboarding perspective. How do we onboard folks who've never been part of the organization before and now are coming on board? So again, it's coming back to technologies like this and being very purposeful in reaching out and making these connections. It's very easy to focus on the business side of the organization and the task side and the work side. So I think it's really important to build in, again, these social elements, both of getting to know folks on the team and asking other members of the team to talk about who they are, what their hobbies are, these different things that they would normally find out in much more social situations that we, again, best be planful for in holding these conversations and including them again in the team social activities that we're working to engage people through in this virtual environment. Those are some of the things that I've heard about, and I'll pass it over to others for what they've heard about as well.
Sure. Any additional comments, Nita?
Yeah, so this conversation is surprising because it didn't start this year. It actually started a couple of years ago when employers went to exclusively remote workplaces and they were struggling with how do you bring on an employee who's never actually been part of the org culture. Some of the best practices that have been recommended include finding a mentor or a workplace coach who's within the team who can kind of bring the person on under their wing. The other thing is to extend some of the initial meetings that you have with that employee. So if you've got an agenda and the agenda is a 50-minute agenda, try to make that meeting kind of an hour and 10 minutes long. So you do have an opportunity for more of that social connection and interaction that happens. It gives an opportunity for them to ask questions. One of the things that me and my colleagues at work do that I've taken a little bit of a leadership role on is this thing called corridor chats, which is we all shared a corridor prior to COVID. And what we've done is we have someone who was brought on to the department, and I didn't get a chance to meet him that much, but he's invited to the corridor chats. And we sit around and we talk about, for an hour in a week, we sit around and talk about whatever's going on. And it has actually increased my commitment to the organization because I feel committed to my coworkers. So having those kinds of champions in your organizations, you know who your social bodies are in your team, bring them on.
That's great. I know we're having water cooler chats at the chamber with staff, so that's great. I'm going to direct this one first, perhaps to Sandra. The next question is, does the workers' health and safety have specific posters for COVID-19 that will be required to be posted around the office? So have we seen any requirements like that, those changes, Sandra?
I do know that they do supply posters on the website. They do recommend that they're posting, as mentioned when I was speaking earlier, in the washrooms, anywhere there's sinks. In your main office, you should have a poster up with questions. So anyone coming into the building is asked these specific questions before they enter. Like if it's a guest or a customer, or they will be asked, do you have a fever, cough, shortness of breath, and have you traveled outside of the country or anywhere in the last 14 days? So there are posters, and we'll send out the websites that we have available where you can obtain these posters.
Perfect. I think that's going to be a helpful resource, those practical pieces. Now, another question, an interesting one, as we see a lot might be shifting and changing after this crisis passes, is whether any of you foresee a shift to contract workers versus actual, quote unquote, employees. Meaning when we hire people back who work at home, but are not employees. Any feedback about that? Nita, I see you smiling. I'll start with you.
I'm smiling because we see this going through the court systems right now. So we know Foodora and the black Uber drivers, like the Uber black drivers for the airport, have all argued that they're employees. So even though they're technically on a contract, the decision of whether they're an employee legally comes down to who controls the work, who controls the workspace, and who determines the daily activities and oversees the daily activities. Those are the conditions. I do, unfortunately, from my research, have a long history of evidence that suggests that as organizations face adversity, they do shrink their predominant workforce, and they replace their full-time workers with these contract workers who come in for the surges, and the contract workers who they don't have that much liability towards or that much responsibility towards. And the trend traditionally has been a shift away from full-time permanent work. And as much as I like to see the silver lining, given everything that I know from my 16 years of research in job loss, I think this is going to really create a little bit more of a pivot on that slope, and we'll see this happen even more. So for those of us who are lucky enough to be in full-time permanent jobs, holding on to that job is very critical, because I think that organizations responding, especially the ones who are indoctrinated in very capitalistic perspectives, will want to limit their liability here. So it's an unfortunate way to end.
No, that's a good comment. And before I pass it over to see if anyone else has a comment about that shift between full-time employment and contract work, can you speak, Nita, to whether or not you can actually do that for a callback on someone who was already an employee to a contract position?
You can. So you can terminate their employment, like legally you can terminate their employment via a layoff and then call them back on a contract employee. And that's been going on for 15 or 20 years, right? I mean, the big leaders in that are the companies like IBM, who do this as a traditional pattern of shifting their full-time workers into contract employees. So IBM's a good example. Sears did that. A lot of companies traditionally did that once you change the employment contract. But from a social responsibility perspective, from a altruistic, from a humanistic perspective, we know that how we treat our employees gets evaluated by our remaining employees. So our remaining employees are also looking to see, were we fair? Did we have the appropriate practices in place? Are we providing job security? Are we taking care of our employees? Or are we just bottom line driven? And when we get that reputation of being bottom line driven, it will increase the likelihood that people don't want to work for us. They don't want to do the extra work behaviors. They don't want to commit to the organization. So it's like the start of the end for an organization when they start to do this, but it's unfortunately been going on in some companies as an institutional practice for like 15 years.
Thank you, that's helpful. Greg, can you speak to that culture?
Yeah, I'll speak to a few things there, because Nita covered it off well. And the thing that will add to that, as well as I talked about before, economics is going to drive a lot of this, and we're going into a recession, right? So that's the other reason that organizations will look to minimizing their full-time workforce and having more flexibility. Because we go into a recession, they obviously need to be more flexible. But to Nita's point on culture, I was just on a call yesterday with a leader from Italy. Their circumstances are a little different because employers in Italy apparently can't fire anybody or can't lay off anybody during this crisis. So it's a very different scenario. But what they're hearing is employees talking about leaving their current employer because there's no longer a values match, that they're seeing what the true values of their organization are through this crisis, and where the values don't match. When the economy picks back up, those folks will be looking for other places to work. So to Nita's point, how we treat people at this point in time, we've got a real opportunity to live our values, to communicate our values, to be true to who we are as an organization, and the economy will pick up. More people are retiring out of the workforce than there are coming into the workforce. So this trend will change, and people will remember when the economy picks up again, who the great employers are and who they want to go and work for. So yeah, be very careful and make sure you're being true to the brand that you want to be.
That's great feedback. Thank you. I have another question from the participants. And this question is the hybrid situation that Dr. Chhinzer mentioned a good way to reintegrate staff back into the workplace who have been working from home? And are there any suggestions on how to effectively bring back staff who have been working at home? So I'll start with you, Nita.
Just going to unmute. Do you see the visual? I love it, Shakiba. You came up with two very interesting ways to pronounce my last name. So it's Dr. Chhinzer. So Chhinzer. No worries, we're all good. So the idea of hybrid models. I don't know if you've been paying attention to the news, but in New Brunswick, they're doing this thing called housing bubbles. And you have two people who, two different households, and they share. So one of the recommendations that we're making is a recommendation to almost come up with employee bubbles. So when you're bringing back your employees to limit exposure, you may have one group of people who work together, almost like their own platoon, their own deployment unit, and they come in on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And the other team comes in on Mondays and Wednesdays because they work well together. And that means at the end of the day, you're actually going through and cleaning up all of the resources and all of your physical building environment, but you're limiting exposure that way to people who are working together. And so bringing people back to the workplace does mean you have to think very purposely about who's coming back. An alternative consideration too is there are some companies like RBC, which is offering a hazard pay right now, and they're paying an extra $50 a day to people who come in to help cover off some of the additional stress that they're taking on, but also for things like their gas, their parking, and those kinds of things. So that might be an additional consideration. I think bringing people back in the hybrid model means that you have to be very purposeful about how you schedule people. And I highly recommend we start thinking about employee bubbles, and that'll limit the contamination.
Thank you, Dr. Chhinzer. I appreciate that.
You got it.
Sandra, do you have anything to say about that return back to work, especially in the manufacturing sector?
All right, just had to do my unmute there. For us, I know we brought our office people back May 11th. So, we made sure in looking at that, having people return to work, our thing was putting up plexiglass to divide office cubicles that weren't feasible. So that's pretty much where we've been so far, in just bringing them back, making sure that they can physical distance and do it safely. And so far we've been successful.
Okay, that's great to know. Thank you. Here's a really good question I've heard on a number of occasions myself. How worried should we be about mitigating liability for safe workspaces when thinking about doing things like employee shuttles or not providing adequate PPE? What do we know about the liability that may or may not be in place as we return to work? Perhaps first to Dr. Chhinzer.
Okay, I was thinking it might go to Greg since he's the one who introduced the idea of the shuttle. So I hope that we do bounce to Greg and he shares some of those ideas. How do we mitigate liability? So again, from a legal HR strategy perspective, we can mitigate liability, and really what we have to do is not eliminate all of the risks in the workplace. We just have to mitigate those risks. So we put up hand washing stations. If we're going to create an environment where they're sharing something, and I don't recommend the shuttle option myself personally, but if we're creating that, then yes, we are liable for that. And given that I don't recommend it, if someone were to use it, I would say that you have to provide sanitary wipes, you have to give them the option to have their face masks, you want to give them the option to sit every other seat apart. I know the school buses are doing that, the ones that are coming back from Quebec. So if you're going to introduce something new, you are liable for it because you're mandating this to the employee or you're recommending it to the employee. So I don't suggest that we go into those kinds of activities ourselves. However, when it comes back to the workplace, we have to mitigate the risk. So increase hand washing stations, increase those plexiglass, increase those things. We can't make the risk of anything zero. That's not the goal here. The goal here is to reduce the risks by encouraging practices. And the ones that Sandra discussed were fantastic in my opinion.
Thank you.
Greg, do you have anything to add about the shuttles from your experience?
Yeah, and piggybacking on what you were saying, and Nita, you might want to talk to this as well, but the liability, I believe, is ultimately covered off through WSIB or through some insurance. You're shaking your head, so I'll throw it back to you in a moment. The shuttle idea specifically came from employees of that organization who were not feeling safe getting onto crowded public transport at that point in time. I don't think public transport had put in place all the social distancing procedures that are perhaps in place today. So employees said, can we come up with a solution that provides us the opportunity to be more physically distant in our commute into work? So yes, there is some liability there. Nita can perhaps explain how WSIB enters the equation here. But again, it's doing everything reasonable. And this organization in particular has been exceedingly proactive in putting things in place to help people feel safe. And back to this flexibility and collaboration, it's working with employees as to what do you need to make you feel safe in the workplace, and if it's feasible, we will do what we can to ensure it's there.
Right. So if I could jump back in on the liability. So liability, there's legal liability, but we also think there's social liability, right? So socially, are we being responsible by then suggesting that all of our employees get into a contained physical unit and move back and forth? I wouldn't recommend that. If someone had come to me and said the challenge for us is our employees can't come into work, well, then I would actually recommend maybe we could take a look at some short-term rentals of cars and use that as a company expense and give them the option, help them find parking, and then still maintain that physical distancing requirement. My big concern with the liability also here is also brand liability. Imagine if we had a shuttle bus going back and forth and there was an outbreak and our brand would be dragged through the mud because of this kind of activity. So I'm thinking also, you know, we're trying to protect our brand, we're trying to protect our employees, we're trying to do what's best. And in this case, I wouldn't have recommended the shuttle. I would have recommended alternative options, such as if you can't work from home, then we can come up with, you know, getting you a rental car and maybe taking on some of that expense for the rental car, the difference between your bus pass and the rental car, something like that, and kind of engage in that.
That's great. I really appreciate how practical and tangible all of your examples have been. And I really appreciate, I know all of those attending appreciate your expertise on an important issue. So this does conclude our weekly webinar on HR planning in a post-COVID world. In next week's webinar, we will be diving into strategies required by business leaders to pursue corporate sustainability during and after COVID-19. Featuring Chris Cutler, CEO of GlobeScan, and from the Lang School, Associate Professor and Sustainability Expert, Dr. Rumina Dalla. Thank you all for listening. Don't forget to follow us on social media for continued conversation. Look us up at Guelph Chamber and at Lang Business. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you all.